thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry I have a French accent, but I can't help it. I've tried it for many years, but it's still there. So, let us speak about hope. Usually the persons who hope start going toward an horizon that they can now neither perceive nor predict. Yet, this horizon already touches him or her and prevents them from remaining where they are. Their hope might be founded on imagination, on a bet, on reason, or on a promise. But it does not rely on any precise positive knowledge that one could transmit to someone else, since hope always exceeds what we know. To hope means not to agree to the idea that fate and necessity are the true and ultimate explanations of what is, and also to negate the notion that amor fati, meaning love of fate, is the noblest wisdom. It also means to perceive how we may get out of tragedy and despair while at the same time recognizing their terrible force and danger in our lives. The one who hopes is not a naive person, at least not always. I want to emphasize here that hope has nothing to do with optimism, meaning the belief that things will get better anyway, even if we remain passive. Now, as we shall see, hope needs courage and action. Indeed, in spite of a nihilism that is so often prevalent nowadays, and which describes hope as a pathetic or laughable attitude, hope does not disappear from most human lives. On the contrary, it always seems ready to come back in our lives on the pretense of the humblest signs of encouragement. Hope may concern the history of a precise person, of a group of people, or, as we shall see, of humanity as such. In any case, hope urges one who is vigilant enough to discern new possibilities that remain hidden in a particular situation, as well as in the human condition as such, and to work for the realization of these possibilities. Yet, as Bergson, the philosopher Bergson, rightly pointed out, it might be the other way around. It is because one works for their realization that these possibilities reveal themselves as such and give us hope. Although some philosophers, for instance, the Stoics in the Antiquity and Spinoza, think that hope is but a dream or an imaginary consolation for the persons who suffer without being wise enough to agree to their fate, hope remains a great force in most lives. When human beings fight for justice, for instance, or for curing terrible illnesses, they hope they will succeed, and their hope is also for times to come, which means they are able to transcend their own finitude. It even seems that without hope, no one could live. It is true that many concrete hopes, be they personal or collective, remain unsuccessful, and we feel disappointed about them. Yet, and this is my main point, I think that we have to pay attention to the subjective attitude of the person who is hoping that something precise will happen, and to dissociate his or her attitude from this particular aim. To remain able to hope, in spite of all our disillusions, is indeed an attitude towards the present, meaning it is the ability to allow oneself be surprised whenever something good or beautiful happens, even when it has nothing to do with what we had wished to happen. Such an attitude does not mean that we know how to get over failures and even cruel disappointments, but it prevents us from thinking and feeling that the latter constitute the whole reality. If a certain measure of irrationality seems necessary here, it may also mean that in spite of its necessity so as to avoid dramatic illusions, and of its greatness also, reason alone can't help us feeling so. A philosopher may argue that, as it is the case with consciousness, which is always consciousness of something, hope must also be hope of something. It is true that when we hope, our thought, our imagination, and our sensibility, our entire person, are looking forward something. Yet, we lack any true representation of the good event that we are expecting. When hope occurs, we discern a possibility of an intentionality that remains without any accurate and objective correlate. We have a glimpse on what we can't experiment or describe in a precise way, thanks to pertinent concepts or even to poetical images. Our theories fail to grasp this attitude. Thus, if we say, for instance, that in Messianic times, I quote the prophet Isaiah in the Bible, the wolf and the lamb shall feed together, and the lion shall eat straw like the bullock, end of this quotation, it does not mean that we have got here the right signs that will allow us to recognize these famous messianic times when they come, if they come. The object of our hope always exceeds any representation of it, even when the person is a prophet, as Isaiah. Such is also the case with a community of persons which has received a biblical education, or on the contrary, a complete secular one that justifies nonetheless the legitimacy of our hopes that one day peace will prevail. The realization of something that we have been longing for always exceed our representations of it. We do not recognize it when it happens. We wonder whether it is what we wanted. It has always got in it something surprising, unexpected, unheard of. That is why people rarely feel satisfied when this realization occurs. They don't recognize what they have been expecting. Instead of greeting what happens, they are disappointed and even resentful. It is true that sometimes the so-called realization of one high hope is indeed a complete disaster, a dire caricature of it. That is precisely why generations of men and women who had been expecting a fraternal society, a society without classes, thinking that history was leading humanity towards such a society, felt when discovering the perversion of the supposed realization of it in some countries. This is also why despair and cynicism grow facing such blighted hopes. Generally speaking, people who criticize or even despise the attitude of the persons who hope are eager to nourish their critics by underlying such cruel deceptions. Yet, I want to argue that hope is necessary in human life. One may not forget it without forgetting oneself, especially during dramatic times, when we realize that nothing has happened in the way we were so much expecting it to happen, be it a recovery, a success, or a liberation, for instance. But it means that one learns how to hope otherwise, without expecting something precise that our imagination would grasp or that our desire would conquer. The tension which characterizes hope may be described as a passion, a virtue, or a grace, but it may not be linked to the illusion that it is up to us to decide what is exactly the object of our hope. What remains unhoped for always comes at his own time. It is up to us to be ready to receive it and not the other way around. The subjective attitude that I have described here is prior to the different objects of love, of hope. Such an attitude is not a reflexive one, and it starts very early in life. It is also linked to many common behaviors. No child would ever speak if he was not expecting someone to listen to him. No person would listen to her if they were not expecting her to grow up. A human being would never get up in the morning if he was not hoping to enjoy some good or beautiful minutes during the day, even when he is full of sorrow and sadness. Without this tiny perhaps, human beings may become wise, but most of the time they become dreadful. In his Divine Comedy, Dante, the famous poet Dante, wrote that those who enter hell lose all hopes. This is the characterization of hell in Dante's poesy. Unfortunately, we are aware that some people want this hell to be our lot now, during our lifetime. To put it briefly, very briefly, our Western civilization, meaning, yes, Europe, Western civilization, is heir to two different traditions about hope. On the one hand, the Greek world underlines the importance of fate, both in Homer's poem and in the tragedies written by Achilles, Sophocles, and Euripides, and on the other one, second tradition of our culture, the biblical world stresses the significance of hope. It is true that Greek philosophers have wanted to alleviate the burden of fate, especially Plato and Aristotle, quote only a few. In his Republic, the big dialogue by Plato, Plato writes that gods are innocent as regards what happens to us since we are indeed responsible for the choice we make of what kind of life we decide to live, even when we deny it. See the myth of air at the end of the Republic. While in his Phaedo, Socrates, and Phaedo is description of Socrates' death, in his Phaedo, Socrates praises hope, elpis. The word is repeated several times, but only because Socrates hopes to enjoy an enlightened life after his death. According to the Greek source of our culture, hope doesn't appear to be linked to temporality and history. While in the Bible, second source of our culture, especially hope is indeed the tiny, tiny golden thread that appears again and again, especially when people seem to be in a doomed situation. There are indeed many such situations in the Bible, both personal and collective, but there are also many new beginnings. Some example, for those of you who know a little about the Bible, Seth, the third child of humanity, is born after Cain has killed Abel. The terrible story of Joseph and his jealous brothers who have tried to get rid of him leads way to their reconciliation. Despite Job's apparently complete despair, despair does not completely win in the terrible book. This is a terrible book in the Bible, I don't know whether you agree with it. Although one must not read it as if it was leading us toward a happy end, but Job himself, who suffers a lot for terrible situation, wonders, I quote him, "What is my strength that I should hope?" And even, last example, in the terrible lamentation of Jeremiah in the Bible about the destruction of Jerusalem, we read, "There may be hope." Ulai yesh tikva. From the biblical point of view, hope is never justified by our bet, our judgment, or our imagination. It is first founded by God's word or promise. It starts with his promise to Abraham that he will bless him so that he will become a great people, and he also promised him that all the family of the earth, universality of this blessing, will be blessed. In thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Genesis chapter 12. A promise is a blessing, and then we'll come again to this word in my conclusion from a very simple point of view. A blessing, and every human being needs to receive a blessing and be inhabited by it. A blessing, what does it mean? It means a good word. Benediction. It comes from Latin. A good word. A good word. Everyone must have received at least one good word in his life, so as to be able to grow. And I will come back to this idea, to hope, even when there are no reason to hope. The prophets have emphasized the idea that human history is not governed by fate, but that it depends on our achieving what God's promised about a happier future for the Jewish people and for all these families of the earth requires from us personally and collectively. This biblical hope also leads us to think about death as something other than an ultimate defeat. It is even said in the Talmud. The Talmud is many books that are a commentary to the Bible, put it very briefly. And in the Talmud it is said that one main question will be asked to us when we will arrive in the world to come, Olam Haba. So notice this question that we will be asked. Did you keep hope alive in yourself during your life? So be ready to answer this question. Let. This promise is not reducible to a rational idea. Be it the most beautiful of all ideas, but for all that, it is not irrational. It enlarges our reasons and our emotions. It gives, and I will use a Hebrew word that I like very much, the word tam. It gives tam. Why I like this word? Because it means signification, taste, and flavor. The three of this is, it gives tam to our lives. Yet, it is not an easy business to remain hopeful. So, I will explain a little more what does hope mean in the Bible. Then I'll turn to two philosophers, Levinas and we teach us that hope requires from us a radical change in the way we understand our finitude, and a secular thinker, Bloch, Ernest Bloch, a Marxist philosopher. And in my conclusion, I'll go back to the word I have already mentioned, benediction, in a secular way, and I will give you two examples of what it can mean for us, and even in dreadful situation, as will be my last example. So a few more words about biblical hope, and then Levinas. So in the Bible, hope, tikva, as I have already argued, is certainly the golden thread, as I have already said, that prevents people from believing brutality and wars, suffering and despair are the true and ultimate reality. Whenever something unhappy and tragic happens, the Bible is always looking for a new perspective. How is that? Why do some people usually hope that doom and despair are not their ultimate destiny, and especially will not be the fate of their children? They may rely on their courage, on their strength, or on the hope of people, but in the Bible, it's usually also because they rely on God's promise to Abraham and to his offspring. What does it mean? This promise is usually linked to the future, rather than to escape from time, as was the case with Plato that I have quoted before. Such a future already begins now, in the present days, and it prevents us from despairing and thinking nothing good will ever happen. Despair means the impossibility to receive the fragility of the world. Despair means the impossibility to imagine a new beginning. Now, hope is precisely required in such circumstances, when this fragility is overwhelming. There is no need to hope in happy and secure circumstances. It is precisely because we suffer and experiment our fragility and the fragility of other human beings and of the world that hope is necessary. A promise wants us to consider a future different from the present. It will not be a mere repetition of what is currently happening or of what has been our lot in past times. But it does not mean that God has any plan for our history, as some people argue, and how do they know God has any plan is a mere mystery for me. This promise is not necessarily accomplished by history, as some philosophers, such as Kant and Hegel, have argued. Kant, for instance, was waiting for God's plan or nature's plan to be realized within history in spite of and thanks to the wars that prevailed in Kant's time and the wars that will inevitably occur later on. One day, Kant argued, peace and justice would overcome. People will be able to create a perfect cosmopolite and universal situation which will allow people to develop all their human potentialities. Although such a description of the ultimate times might be compared to some of the prophets' images of the future that God has promised to Israel, such a philosophical rationalization does not recognize what biblical hope really means. It is not reducible to this secular hope which both the age of enlightenment and later on the revolutionary movements have approved of, arguing that a just and peaceful society will emerge from the terrible struggles that occur in history. What is the difference between biblical hope and this historical and sometimes revolutionary hope? In the first case, and in the first case only, the promise enlightens the future. It helps us rely on the maybe that is hidden in the events that occur, but only provided that we don't forget the covenant with God, which gives this hope its true signification. In order for future times to be peaceful and just, we must also remain faithful to this covenant. That is to say, we must agree to transform ourselves. Otherwise, this good future will never occur. The great prophets who have given biblical hope its most important features in the midst of the terrible events that were happening in their time never separated this hope from the promise and from the necessary transformation of everyone in the people. A benediction, a good word, helps us to do so, especially when we despair. The prophets' strength did not come from their own cleverness or imagination, at least not only, but from this good word, from the certainty that some good word was hidden within human souls. A good word that one could despise and forget, but not completely destroy. I turn to Levinas. Contrary to common understanding, what we hope for is not an object, be it peace, justice, good health, exterior to our hope. If such were the case, it would mean that hope is but a compensation, a reward, or a salary even, that one may expect to receive one day. Now, according to Levinas, who is here faithful to this biblical tradition concerning hope, I quote him, "The expectation of fortunate events is not of itself hope. Because if this were the case, then it would mean that what remains irreparable in the past would be forgotten. I quote him again, "This compensating time is not enough for hope, for it is not enough that tears be wiped away or death be advanced. No tear is to be lost, no death without a resurrection. The true object of hope," says Levinas, "is the Messiah or salvation." There is hope only when hope is no longer permissible. What is irreparable in the instant of hope is that that instant is a present. The future can bring consolation or compensation to a subject who suffers in the present, but the very suffering of the present remains like a cry whose echo will resound forever in the eternity of spaces. At least it is so in the conception of time which fits our life in the world and which we shall call the time of economy. Opposite to such an ordinary viewpoint about hope, Levinas says, all the acuteness of hope in the midst of despair comes from the exigency that the very instant of despair be redeemed. Hope hopes for the present itself. It also means that even the most fortunate end of history, even the happiness of humanity as a whole, whatever it may mean, does not justify the suffering of the individual. We see here that Levinas criticizes a teleological interpretation of history, teleological, a finality, that justifies the sufferings of the individuals as an unfortunate but necessary step for a better future. See Kant, Hegel, and even Marx. According to him, such an interpretation, be it a religious one or a secular one, always misses the point of hope. It is also completely immoral, facing the terrible sufferings of so many people. No theodicy, not even a secular one, remains possible after the terrible events that happened in the 20th century and that continue to happen in this new century, as you know. In the text of Levinas that I have quoted, he refers to the Messiah, and he links the name of the Messiah to, I quote, the caress of a consoler, which softly comes in our pain and whose concern is the very instant of physical pain, which is then no longer condemned to itself, is transported elsewhere by the movement of the caress and is freed from the vice grip of oneself, finds fresh air, a dimension and a future. Or rather, it announces more than a simple future, a future where the present will have the benefit of a recall. And according to the Talmud, one of the Messiah's name is indeed the consoler, Menachem in Hebrew. There is a whole discussion, what is his name? And Levinas views it as not someone who is going to come. No. Levinas views it as the vocation of human subjectivity as such. The Messiah is not a special man that will come someday and set history free from all sufferings. Rather, according to him, he stands for our human vocation as such. I come now to my second philosopher, Ernest Bloch. In his famous book, very, very big book, The Principle of Hope, Ernest Bloch establishes an encyclopedia of hopes. So if you want to know all about hope, you will read these 3 tomes. In this encyclopedia, Jewish text, the Bible, but not the Talmud, and all the other traditional texts that are necessary to interpret it, no, only the Bible, plays a key role. Bloch explains that the Bible gives us ground for hope, especially when it describes how the Hebrews escaped from the bondage in Egypt. Hope is also founded on God's answer to Moses when he tells him, what is his name? Moses asks God, what is your name? And the answer of God is really strange. He says, Yeh asher eyeh. I shall be who I shall be. Usually, I don't know how it is translated in English Bible. Usually it is translated, I am who I am. But it's not. It's a future. It's a future. Bloch says the Bible is most interesting, although he's a Marxist, he's not a believer, is most interesting because it gives us hope in the future by teaching us that history is not yet accomplished. Now, human beings don't have to wait for a new Moses. They have to fight for the success of justice, freedom, peace, and happiness, which are real possibilities, although they still remain hidden. When Isaiah reminds the people of the fast which God had chosen, that is to say, to loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke, to deal one's bread to the hungry, and to bring the poor that are cast out to one's house. Isaiah chapter 58. By the way, this is this precise text which is read on Yom Kippur, the Great Pardon, when people fast in a very concrete way, so they are reminded, you fast, but don't forget this. Bloch could understand this prophecy as describing some of the manufacture of what he called the homeland, Hemat, he was expecting in due time. So, on the one hand, Bloch is interested by the dreams of human beings, since it means they do not accept defeat. He writes in praise of utopia and imagination, which show that human subjective life is greater than what is. The category of possibility is thus one main category of the subjective life, according to him. On the other hand, he takes for granted that the world itself is not compact, as he says, not yet at the end of its own possibilities, and he describes it as a process. Bloch is a Marxist, as I have said already, who does not believe that progress is a necessary device. Is optimistic, but not in a simple ideological way. He says that historical process relies on certain conditions that have to mature before human beings can play their part. His optimism is that of an activist who wants to liberate the oppressed element within a society, but knows that everything is not possible at once. He writes in favor of a new alliance, no more an alliance between God and human beings, but an alliance or covenant between human beings' dreams and the disposition toward constructive change that are already inscribed within the depth of reality. One has to act according to the possibilities of the historical process, which means one has to be on the front, Bloch's word. The philosopher speaks of a materialist hope. Past time still contains a future that has not yet been realized. This future is not a return to the past, but rather something completely new, although one may compare it to the biblical eschatological times predicted by the prophets, and which Bloch interprets in a complete secular way, he quotes Isaiah announcing new heavens and a new earth that will be created by God, and he praises the category of novum. The novum is prior to the ultimum, which will be its triumph. Bloch assumed that one who fights for a just, free, and peaceful future is also fighting for what he calls the good. This good is a possibility hidden in the objective process of reality, and the person who is on the revolutionary front of history is anxious to make it become concrete. The person who understands what kind of actions are necessary now in order to remain on the front will not take into account the point of view of those who do not agree with them. More than that, such a point of view, so the revolutionaries argue, is hostile to hope. One has to fight against it in order to remain on the right side of history. It is, of course, an old story. Human beings have always tried to clear themselves of whatever violence they have been using while pretending acting for a better future. It is also typical of Western thoughts, explicit or implicit theodicy. Pains are subordinated to a finality, be it religious or materialistic, glimpsed by faith or belief in progress. That Levinas says it's the grand idea necessary to the inner peace of souls in our distressed world. It is also the grand idea necessary for committing, and we know it goes on happening, terrible acts without feeling any remorse of conscience. This is made clear by the Polish writer Czesław Miłosz, if you have heard of him, attempt to argue that in the fight for the better future praised by Bloch, communism, there is no room for pity, for moral consciousness. In fact, Miłosz says, whenever science or rational objectivity is a substitute for conscience, one feels entitled to commit terrible acts in the name of the future. One wants to do away with one's own doubts, and one refuses to testify now to the ideals one is fighting for. Sometimes revolutionary ideals are really present in the community of those who fight. One had been in a community where hope was more normal than apathy and cynicism, where the word comrade stood for comradeship and not, as in most countries, for humbug. George Orwell, the British writer George Orwell, writes in Homage to Catalonia. When such is the case, the future the comrades are fighting for really seems worth working hard and even losing one's own life. But when betrayal between the comrades occurs, as was the case in Catalonia, or hatred prevails over concern for the people, how may one still trust in this just and happy future? This is precisely what happened to Orwell, who suddenly found himself guilty of Trotskyism and imprisoned by his former comrades. Is it possible to hope for the fulfillment of a just and peaceful society if we do away with our conscience and take science or a so-called rational process of history as a substitute for it? In the 20th century, so many terrible tragedies occurred in the name of the good, that it is no longer possible to link hope and theodicy. Suffering and evil inflicted deliberately, but in a manner no reason set limits to, in the exasperation of reason, become political and detached from all ethics, Levinas says, concluding that the most revolutionary fact of the century is the end of theodicy. So what then becomes of hope, and it will be my conclusion. It seems necessary to transmit a blessing, a good word, stronger than the numerous evil speaking that prevail to the new generations. Hope may rise when they discover, this new generation, that they are inhabited by a spiritual strength, even if it has been hidden for a long time. On that matter, all those who point out injustices and happiness as a source of despair, especially among young people, are certainly right. But when they start, as some do, generally for political reasons, to justify the violent and destructive behavior of some of these young people, these persons are evil speaking. It is the case because it prevents these young people from finding in themselves the strength to act otherwise. Now, a person may hope because he or she is inhabited by at least one good word, and it is necessary to try to listen to it and to help other people listen to it. It doesn't mean one has to come to terms with injustices, humiliations, violence, and so on, although it was not important. That would be a Stoic attitude indeed, and I do not endorse such a philosophy. Injustices, humiliation, violence do hurt very deeply, and that is also precisely why one has to fight so as not to forget the good word I mentioned, and to transmit it to the new generations while history remains so dreadful. So, in my last word, I will give two examples of what I mean by this good word. First example. Levinas recalls that in 1941, a hole in history, a year when all the visible gods had abandoned us, where God was truly dead or had gone back to his irrevelation, Léon Bloch, who was a very famous French politics, who was in prison at that time, finished a book for the generations to come, for a time in which it would no longer be. And Levinas underlines the dimension of hope and nobility inherent in this project. I quote him, "A man in prison continues to believe in an unrevealed future and invites us to work in the present for the most distant things of which the present is an irrefutable denial. Yet, in order that hope may continue to promise us a world, even when confusion and misery predominate, it is not enough to fight for justice or peace. One must let this justice and this peace illuminate one's own psyche now, even in the dark times." And I will now quote my last example. Some time ago, I read again a book by Emeritus Kertész. Emeritus Kertész is a Nobel writer. He received the Nobel Prize, and he is from Hungary, and he was sent to Auschwitz when he was quite young, 15 or something like that, I don't remember exactly. And he wrote different books, but I was reading again a book called Kaddish for the child. I don't know the title exactly in English.
Kaddish for an unborn child.
Kaddish for an unborn child. No, so this is the title of the book. And Kaddish, for those of you who do not know, it's a very important prayer in Judaism. It's especially said when somebody is dead, but not only, but especially persons. So in this book, which is a very terrible book, but in the middle of the book, he recalls something very interesting. He said that one day